From Mars Warlogs, Bound by Flame, Technomancer to now GreedFall. Having spent over 50 hours, approximately 35 of which was dedicated to a full playthrough on the extreme difficulty, Spiders' new 17th century styled fantasy RPG is without a shadow of a doubt their best yet, although it does often try to punch above its weight. This review contains no significant spoilers. In GreedFall, you play as Desarde, a high-ranking official of the Congregation of Merchants, a nation politically neutral in the ongoing standoff between the certainly loosely Middle Eastern-inspired, alchemically minded Bridge Alliance, and the theocratic, magically enhanced nation of Theleme, which is to say they're quite fond of burning things. Your task as an up-and-coming royal is to uphold this neutrality. I'm sure that'll work out just fine on a newly discovered mysterious island that might contain the secrets to cure the hideous Malachor, the terminal disease that is currently wrecking the mainland. GreedFall as such features a refreshing fantasy setting. Beyond these three nations, there are two additional factions in the form of the sea-dominating Nauts, responsible for all sea transport regardless of faction, and the mercenary armies of the Coin Guard. The island itself, however, is already heavily populated by a decentralized group of people simply referred to as the natives, with each of their tribes having slightly different morals and, more importantly, different opinions of the recent settlers. Interestingly, throughout the majority of the game you'll find no clear and present antagonist. Instead, conflicts are character-driven, and often the result of these factions interacting with one another, and predominantly interacting with the natives. As a result, each of the 5 other factions have their own set of linear questlines, but the order in which you follow them is freeform beyond a few main storyline cutoff points. In GreedFall you will also be joined by 5 companions, and surprising no one I'm sure, these are directly tied to each of these 5 factions, and likewise have their own linear trio of quests to follow. Although companions are relatively limited in direct conversations, they do have plenty of ambient voice lines, and taking the appropriate companion with you for the right mission will result in them usually popping up to voice their opinion, which mostly results in easier quest progression. That is, unless you piss them off, though you really have to work for it to achieve that outcome. Luckily, despite a few obvious tropes, such as most members of Theleme and the Bridge Alliance being overly fond of lovingly calling the natives savages, this story does contain a believable narrative with plenty of shades of grey, though the 50 kind of shades involving romanceable companions aren't all that fleshed out. And very few factions are actually portrayed through one unified color. Desarde, the main character in turn, is certainly not a blank canvas and takes their role of diplomat very seriously. Though you can sway your version of Desarde more towards the benevolent or bloodthirsty, don't expect to be raising your chosen faction flag on top of a mountain of skulls made out of your enemies. Although your quests will have you make the occasional faction and relationship decision, in the end you're usually trying to solve situations with the lowest body count possible, as Desarde is not set on starting any wars anytime soon. As I said, you really have to put in work to piss someone off here. Your diplomatic journey and quest for a cure then sees you traveling constantly between the 3 major capitals on the island, and the numerous native tribes scattered throughout the forested regions, and this is easily GreedFall's biggest achievement. Zones are spacious and often impressive, invoking an actual sense of wonder as cities and forests feel properly sized rather than a video game level, and feature plenty of beautiful landmarks. Genuinely, not once did I get bored by backtracking through a dense forest, and more often than not I found myself praising the detail in environmental design wherever the game sent me. It should then absolutely be noted that the game's soundtrack does an excellent job of enhancing this experience with music ranging from classical to gloomy and eerie. The downside to this experience, however, is that this achievement is mostly skin deep. Whereas every location is visually pleasing, the direct reward gained by actively exploring is rarely ever present. Loot is usually underwhelming, with most of the legendary items I found not living up to the rarity name, and I found myself quickly regressing to simple but I suppose important fashion choices rather than finding something useful. That is, if you find loot at all. The way GreedFall handles quest objectives and activation is mostly to blame here, I suppose, as usually an area in a particular zone will be functionally pointless until you have the right quest to prompt something in it. And curiously, GreedFall seems almost self-aware of this fact when it comes to the main storyline, but sadly not when it comes to the side quests. You'll find that a lot of side quests suffer from poor pacing, as they have you walk back and forth between buildings or even entire zone maps in order to continue a single quest. Perhaps you have to talk to someone in one zone, who then sends you to talk to someone else entirely in another, who in turn sends you back to one of the previous individuals, all spread out over 3 different maps. Or reaching a particular destination then tells you to craft something, forcing you to walk all the way back to a crafting station before you can actually continue onwards. This would be fine if you could actually stumble upon new events, or if they had laid out the quest in such a way that you could complete multiple at once, but this is rarely if ever the case, making GreedFall feel far more tedious than it has to, despite its gorgeous environments. GreedFall certainly has forced me to walk through the same set of doors more than most games ever have. With main quests, they usually, mercifully, have instant teleportation moments after specific story points, which creates a curious difference in pacing that isn't a good look for GreedFall. Pacing and underwhelming exploration rewards aside though, GreedFall's main narrative and setting really carry it through until the end. The lack of obvious antagonist and high amount of personal interpretation regarding the numerous factions make for a very enjoyable journey in which you try to figure out who you do and don't like, or be it simply learning the native language bit by bit, an element that is well integrated into the writing. Besides being supported by the excellent soundtrack, GreedFall also does a very good job portraying significant events through impressive cutscenes that get better and better as you go along. Now, on the other side of the coin, a fun thing I suppose, we have combat. And to be clear, I enjoy the basic elements of GreedFall's combat. It has an enjoyable flow and there are very few roadblocks, even on the extreme difficulty, which all in all isn't that extreme. However, combat is where GreedFall starts to wander more into the realm of imitation rather than proper execution. First of all, GreedFall features three main weapon types: swords, blunted weapons, and ranged magical attacks. The first two are quite similar. They're both melee weaponry and the skill trees roughly mirror one another, allowing you to improve their damage and ultimately unlock two-handed variants which are slower but have a much bigger area of effect arc. In addition to these main attack types, you can also expand your arsenal with ammo-based guns, traps, and a few basic spells such as the very useful crowd control stasis or the defensive healing and armor buffs. As such, you have roughly three classes in the form of a melee fighter, a ranged gun and trap user, or a ranged spell user, though in all likelihood you'll mix and match a little bit here and there, and although the attribute system doesn't promote this much, it's an easy enough thing to pull off, giving you a basic level of freedom in how you like to approach combat. Now, the main problems with combat are a little bit more fundamental. First of all, I mentioned armor, and enemies use this as well in addition to their health bar. In essence, some weapons are bad against armor, swords, and some are good against armor, blunted weapons. The problem, however, is that ignoring armor is far too easy to do for the slow, low-damage blunted weapons to ever be effective, let alone enjoyable, as they simply slow down your game significantly more than anything else available. If you focus on guns and traps, you'll shred armor. If you focus on magic attacks, you ignore armor entirely, making it completely irrelevant, and if you focus on swords, you'll find your fury attacks, which cost adrenaline, which is gained by simply doing an attack or casting a spell, still mostly ignore armor. And more to the point, deal such an incredible amount of damage, they trivialize most encounters. The end result of this armor system is that you'll simply ignore it, or actually try to actively deal with it in the form of blunted weapons, and suddenly combat will simply slow down significantly, making it far more tedious. In the end, regardless of difficulty, I simply didn't see the functional reason for armor existing, as it felt more limiting than interactive. Secondly, in GreedFall your main defenses are either dodging or parrying, and both of these start to fall into the realm of simply spamming it quite rapidly. Initially I assumed some attacks had to be dodged specifically or parried specifically, but neither is the case, as every attack in the game can both be dodged or blocked depending on your own preference. Parrying is rewarded by returning a decent amount of damage back, at the cost of requiring a slightly tighter activation window. Dodging, meanwhile, is without downside. I also found it rather pointless to have to unlock rolling, or in the case of a mage playstyle, dashing. Both of these are functionally the same, and after unlocking these the combat flow is noticeably more enjoyable, but once more, the issue here is one of limitation, as they require you to go through specific weapon styles to unlock. Although I found boss fights especially enjoyable in GreedFall, I found it very disappointing that there wasn't a bigger focus on specific attacks that had to be dodged, or specific attacks that had to be parried. If they had designed these in such a way, it would allow for more complexity in what is otherwise a very, very basic combat system. And then, thirdly, we simply have some ugly meta elements related to combat that showed their faces quite frequently in the earlier hours, but did become less relevant as the game went on. For one, enemies with guns can fire through walls and terrain. As gun damage is quite high, this can make for a nasty surprise. Although as the vast majority of fights will eventually be outdoors, it wasn't an issue for long. More annoyingly were the leash ranges on enemy encounters, which is often the same as their aggro range, meaning that the moment you start to dodge backwards or try to kite them with a more ranged build, you'll often run into scenarios where enemies start to heal fully and return to their original spot. In the end, nothing is quite there when it comes to combat. Although at its core the fluidity and flow is fine, and certainly I didn't find myself annoyed by combat at any stage, it does start to feel trivial outside of boss fights quite rapidly. In conclusion, GreedFall is an ambitious RPG, but one marred by mechanical disappointment. It shines brightest in its story, narrative, and environmental design, and luckily these parts are excellent enough to make the entire experience enjoyable from start to finish. Characters and companions are enjoyable. Siora especially is an excellent companion, and exploring the island and native culture makes for a fun journey in the end. If you're looking for a competent narrative and atmospheric experience with a refreshing setting, GreedFall is certainly a solid game to pick up. Thank you for watching, my name is Benhas. If you did already play GreedFall, I'd love to hear your thoughts about the game, and I'll see you in the next video or livestream.